Smoke curls through the dim light of a Manhattan alley. A man in a tailored suit steps from a black Packard, his fedora shadowing eyes that have seen too much. This is the world of Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man who would turn crime into an empire, and enemies into stepping stones. The city hums like a living beast, its veins pumping with ambition, greed, and fear. From the docks of the East River to the jazz clubs of Harlem, power is traded like currency, and no one understands that trade better than Lucky Luciano. He wasn't just another gangster with a gun and a temper. He was something rarer, a strategist, a visionary, a man who saw the Mafia not as a mob of killers, but as a corporation, structured, disciplined, and bound by profit. In a time when most mobsters lived by blood oaths and superstition, Luciano lived by logic. Every decision he made, every risk he took, was calculated, as if he were playing chess on a board where every piece could kill him. To understand his genius, you must first understand his enemies. They were not only the rival mob bosses who wanted him dead but also the politicians, the police, and the federal prosecutors who sought to destroy his empire. Yet, time and time again, he slipped through their grasp, outthinking, outmaneuvering, and outlasting them all. He was the embodiment of modern organized crime, elegant, ruthless, and terrifyingly intelligent. As the camera moves through the smoky streets of 1930s New York, we see the forces that shaped him, the Italian immigrants struggling to survive, the corruption that linked the underworld to City Hall, and the chaos of prohibition that gave birth to kings. Luciano didn't invent crime, but he reinvented how it worked. He brought order to chaos, profit to violence, and strategy to bloodshed. His mind was sharper than any knife, his charm deadlier than any bullet. And yet, beneath the legend of Lucky Luciano lies something far more human: fear. The fear of poverty, of insignificance, of being powerless in a world that respected only strength. Every crime, every betrayal, every murder he ordered, all were part of one desperate pursuit: control. Control over his destiny, his world, and the people who stood in his way. The streets may have whispered his name with awe, but to those who truly knew him, Luciano was both savior and serpent. Some called him a genius. Others, a devil. But all agreed on one thing: no one ever beat Lucky Luciano. Not the law. Not his rivals. Not even fate. At least, not for a very long time. Tonight, we journey into the mind of the man who changed the rules of power, the immigrant who built an empire of fear and respect, and who proved that intellect, not violence, was the deadliest weapon of all. This is not just the story of a gangster. It's the story of how one man rewrote the language of crime, and outsmarted every enemy he ever had. Before Lucky Luciano rose to power, New York was a battlefield. The city in the early 1900s pulsed with hunger, corruption, and rage, a place where immigrant dreams collided with brutal reality. The underworld wasn't an empire yet, it was a patchwork of street gangs, ethnic mobs, and territorial wars. Each neighborhood was ruled by its own small-time tyrant, men who valued brute force over brains, and vengeance over vision. Blood spilled for pride, for a corner, for an insult. The Italian gangs fought the Irish. The Jews fought the Italians. The police, many on the take, played both sides. It was a time when loyalty meant survival, and survival often meant murder. The Mafia as America knows it today didn't exist. Instead, there were the Black Hand extortionists, brutal, unorganized thugs who preyed on their own communities. They kidnapped shop owners, sent death threats written in broken English, and demanded money under the promise of protection. Fear was their only business model. They terrorized the same Italian immigrants they claimed to represent, and for years, they ruled through chaos. There was no structure, no code, no central authority, just greed and blood. Downtown Manhattan simmered with tension. In Mulberry Street and Little Italy, rival bosses sent knife-wielding enforcers into crowded markets. Gunfire erupted in broad daylight. Every week, the newspapers carried another headline of gang slaying in the Bowery. The police shrugged, politicians looked the other way, and the city learned to coexist with violence. This was not yet the sleek, organized mafia of later decades, it was primal, raw, and self-destructive. Then came Prohibition in 1920, and everything changed. The 18th Amendment turned alcohol into gold. Overnight, bootlegging became the most lucrative business in the nation, and suddenly, chaos turned into opportunity. The gangs that once fought over pennies were now fighting over millions. But opportunity didn't bring unity, it brought more blood. The streets became killing fields, as rival bootleggers hijacked shipments and executed competitors. It was a new economy, but still built on old violence. At the same time, the police and politicians played their own games. Corruption ran deep. Judges could be bought, detectives could be bribed, and city officials often shared profits with the very men they swore to hunt. The criminal world and the political world were mirror images, both rotten, both ruthless. In this world, morality was a luxury. The lines between law and crime blurred until they became meaningless. By the late 1920s, two forces dominated the underworld: Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano, Sicilian old guard mobsters who clung to the traditions of the homeland. They ruled through fear and superstition, demanding absolute loyalty and obedience. Their soldiers were expected to die for them, not think for themselves. The Mafia was still bound to the feudal mindset of Sicily: boss and servant, command and obedience. And for all their power, these men were trapped in the past. They didn't understand the new America, a place where business ruled and efficiency mattered more than pride. This was the chaotic world Luciano inherited, a world of endless vendettas, backroom assassinations, and rigid traditions. He watched how stupidity and ego kept powerful men weak. He saw bosses who refused to adapt, who preferred killing to negotiation, and who treated business like a blood feud instead of a system. He understood something they didn't, that America was changing, and if the Mafia didn't change with it, it would die. Out of this chaos, a new idea began to form in his mind. What if the gangs could stop killing each other and start working together? What if, instead of ruling through fear, he could rule through organization? Luciano envisioned something radical, a criminal democracy, where families had territories, businesses, and peace enforced not by blood, but by structure. The underworld didn't need another warlord. It needed a leader who could think like a businessman. The stage was set. The old world of the Black Hand was crumbling, and the new age of organized crime was waiting to be born. In the shadows of tenements and speakeasies, among the poor immigrants and corrupt cops, a new kind of power was rising, not built on brute strength, but on calculation. And in that storm of greed and violence, one young man named Lucky Luciano was preparing to change everything. Salvatore Lucania was born in 1897 in the small Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, where poverty clung to every wall and opportunity was a word spoken only in dreams. His father, Antonio, worked as a sulfur miner, a job that blackened lungs and broke bodies before a man reached middle age. His mother, Rosalia, prayed for something better for her children. When Salvatore was 9, the Lucania family packed their few belongings and boarded a ship for America. Like millions of others, they sailed toward the promise of the New World, a land where even the poorest might rise. But the boy who stepped off the ship at Ellis Island would soon learn that in America, survival had its own brutal price. They settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city, a cramped labyrinth of tenements, crime, and desperation. Every street corner was controlled by gangs. Irish, Jewish, and Italian kids fought for dominance, and the police rarely intervened. For young Salvatore, school was a distraction. The real education came from the streets: how to fight, how to steal, how to read people. By the age of 10, he was already running errands for local gangsters, slipping envelopes and messages through alleys. It wasn't just about money, it was about belonging. In a city that despised poor immigrants, the gang gave him identity and power. But Salvatore wasn't built like the other street boys who relied on fists and bravado. He had something else, intelligence and a cold kind of courage. He knew when to fight, when to flatter, and when to walk away. He started calling himself Charlie, adopting the American name that would one day rule headlines. The nickname, Lucky, would come later, partly from a story about surviving a knife attack, partly because his enemies couldn't explain how he always came out on top. In truth, luck had little to do with it. As a teenager, Charlie Luciano learned the first rule of survival: never show fear. The gangs around him thrived on intimidation, and fear was the easiest weapon to use. He began organizing his own crew, small-time hustlers who specialized in petty theft, protection rackets, and dice games. He developed a reputation for keeping his cool, even when blood was spilled. The older mobsters noticed the boy's nerve. He wasn't loud, but he was dangerous, because he thought before he struck. Around this time, he met Meyer Lansky, a Jewish kid with sharp eyes and a genius for numbers. Their friendship would become one of the most powerful alliances in organized crime history. In an age when ethnic lines divided everything, Italians, Jews, and Irish rarely mixed, Luciano saw opportunity in cooperation. Where others saw enemies, he saw potential partners. Together with Lansky and another ambitious friend, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, they began experimenting with what would later become the foundation of the modern underworld: cross-ethnic business built on trust, efficiency, and profit. Luciano's early 20s were spent navigating the gray space between legality and crime. Prohibition had begun, and alcohol flowed more freely in speakeasies than it ever had in legal bars. Luciano started running with bigger players, including the powerful Italian mob boss Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masuria. He learned the art of manipulation, how to make a man believe he was in control while you were the one pulling the strings. But even as he served under these older gangsters, Luciano saw their flaws: pride, superstition, and an obsession with old-world power rituals that didn't fit the American system. Then came the moment that defined him, the night he nearly died. In 1929, Luciano was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a beach in Staten Island. The attack was savage, his face slashed beyond recognition. No one ever found out who ordered it, though rumors swirled that it came from within his own circle. But Luciano survived. When he reappeared, his scarred face became a symbol of something terrifying: not weakness, but rebirth. He had faced death and returned colder, smarter, and more ruthless. He would later joke that the attack was the best thing that ever happened to him. From that day forward, no one forgot that Lucky Luciano was unkillable. The immigrant boy from Sicily had become a man of Manhattan. He dressed impeccably, spoke softly, and moved like someone who already knew his destiny. He studied not just criminals, but businessmen, politicians, and bankers, people who commanded power without ever holding a gun. Luciano understood that real control wasn't earned through violence, but through influence. A man could kill one enemy at a time, but he could own hundreds if he learned to make them need him. Every step he took from then on was deliberate. He distanced himself from petty street crime and started building a reputation as a thinker. His crew expanded, his income grew, and his name began to carry weight in circles far beyond the slums of the Lower East Side. The boy who once ran errands for mobsters was now shaking hands with them as an equal. He had learned America's greatest lesson: that power belonged to those who could organize it. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Lucky Luciano was no longer just surviving the system, he was rewriting it. He had mastered both languages, the rough dialect of the streets and the polished speech of men in suits. Behind his calm smile lay an understanding of human nature that bordered on predatory. He knew that fear could control people, but respect could control them longer. The transformation was complete. Salvatore Lucania, the poor Sicilian boy who came to America with nothing, had evolved into Lucky Luciano, the calculating architect of a new kind of crime. He was no longer just a product of the streets, he was their future. And as the Great Depression loomed and America teetered between chaos and opportunity, Luciano was ready to step into the void, not as another gangster, but as the man who would turn crime into an empire. By the time Lucky Luciano entered his 20s, the streets of New York had already hardened him into a survivor, but now he wanted more than survival, he wanted control. The petty crimes of his youth were stepping stones, but he was ready to build an empire. The 1920s were roaring across America, and with prohibition came limitless opportunity for anyone bold enough to seize it. For Luciano, this was not just about selling alcohol, it was about mastering power itself. He began by aligning himself with the right people. Working under Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masuria, Luciano quickly learned how the top men operated, and how outdated their methods were. Masuria was an old-school mafioso who demanded obedience, tribute, and respect through fear. His men kissed his hand and swore loyalty, but Luciano watched how inefficiency and superstition corroded everything. Every business decision required permission. Every disagreement led to bullets. It was a kingdom run on ego. Luciano, on the other hand, saw business in everything, even betrayal, if it served a purpose. In the shadow of Masuria's empire, he quietly built his own network. He managed gambling rings, controlled prostitution, and began investing in bootlegging routes that stretched from Canada to New Jersey. He was learning the logistics of crime, distribution, supply chains, and profit margins. To most, bootlegging was a hustle, to Luciano, it was infrastructure. He understood that whoever controlled the flow of alcohol controlled the city. And so, he used charm and intellect where others used bullets, turning competitors into partners and enemies into assets. His closest allies, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, were instrumental in this transformation. They brought different strengths to the table. Lansky had the mind of an accountant and the instincts of a mathematician, Siegel had charisma and violence in equal measure. Together, they operated like a small startup of criminals, blending intellect, aggression, and strategy. Their collaboration transcended ethnicity at a time when Italians, Jews, and Irish barely trusted one another. Luciano didn't care about bloodlines, he cared about results. It was around this time that Luciano began introducing an entirely new concept to the underworld, the idea of efficiency through organization. He envisioned crime as a structure with departments, managers, and clear boundaries. Each crew would handle its own affairs, but all would pay tribute to a central council. No more random killings that brought unwanted police attention. No more bosses who ruled by paranoia. It was an idea ahead of its time, the Mafia as a corporation. But innovation in the criminal world doesn't come without enemies. Masuria's traditionalists despised Luciano's methods. They viewed his alliances with Jews and Irish as betrayal, his talk of reform as arrogance. To them, crime was sacred, not strategic. Yet Luciano continued pushing his vision quietly, knowing he couldn't reform the system from outside, he had to control it from within. And to do that, he had to survive a war that was coming. He began to play both sides, building ties not just with Masuria, but also with his rival, Salvatore Maranzano, the Sicilian Don leading a rival faction. Luciano smiled in both men's presence, made deals with both, and bided his time. He was studying psychology as much as power, how men thought, what made them paranoid, what made them trust. To him, these gang wars were not about loyalty but about evolution, survival of the smartest. Behind the scenes, he cultivated a new style of leadership. He wore silk suits instead of street clothes, dined with bankers, and spoke to politicians with respect. Luciano wanted to blend into the higher classes, to make crime indistinguishable from business. His underlings noticed. He demanded discipline, punctuality, and efficiency, qualities rarely found in the violent chaos of the mob. His influence began reshaping the culture around him. Young gangsters started to mimic his dress, his mannerisms, even his cool way of speaking. Fear was no longer the only form of power, respect had entered the equation. Then, in the late 1920s, Luciano made his most daring move yet, he turned on his mentor, Masuria. The old boss's arrogance and obsession with power had become liabilities. Luciano orchestrated a quiet rebellion within the ranks, planting seeds of doubt, whispering promises of wealth and peace under his own leadership. Every handshake became a test of loyalty, every drink a negotiation. He was no longer just a participant in the game, he was redesigning the board. His rise from a street hustler to a key underworld player was complete. The streets that once mocked the poor Sicilian boy now feared the man he had become. Every deal he made tightened his grip, every alliance brought him closer to absolute control. He had mastered deception, diplomacy, and danger in equal measure. By the end of the decade, Lucky Luciano had positioned himself not only as a powerful lieutenant but as the only man capable of uniting New York's divided underworld. What set him apart wasn't cruelty, though he could be merciless when needed, it was vision. He saw power not as something to flaunt, but as something to manage. While others sought to dominate through terror, Luciano sought to govern through order. The mob was no longer a gang, it was evolving into an institution. And Luciano, with his scarred face and sharp mind, was its architect. As the 1930s approached, the stage was set for transformation. The old guard of Sicilian bosses clung desperately to their thrones, but a new age was dawning, one shaped not by blood feuds, but by business acumen. Lucky Luciano had learned how to survive, how to build, and now, he was ready to rule. By the early 1930s, New York's criminal landscape was drowning in blood. The Castellammarese War had left a trail of corpses across the city, and every major mafia faction was exhausted. For years, rival bosses like Joe, the Boss, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano had fought a brutal civil war for dominance. Streets ran red, alliances shattered overnight, and no one seemed capable of bringing order to the chaos. Yet, in the smoke and silence after the gunfire, one man saw opportunity, Lucky Luciano. While others sought revenge or territory, he sought structure. He knew that without organization, every empire would eventually collapse. And from the ashes of the old mafia, he would build something new, something immortal. Luciano's first great act as a true leader was also his most treacherous. He orchestrated the assassination of his mentor, Joe Masuria. It was the act that severed his ties to the past and announced his arrival as a power in his own right. The setup was classic Luciano, subtle, strategic, and bloodless in its logic. He invited Masuria to lunch at Coney Island, smiled through the meal, and excused himself to the restroom moments before gunmen burst in and riddled the old boss with bullets. When the smoke cleared, Luciano returned, looked at the body, and left calmly. It was not just a murder, it was a coronation. For a brief moment, Salvatore Maranzano, Masuria's rival, became the most powerful man in New York. He believed Luciano was his loyal protege and rewarded him with influence and wealth. But Maranzano made the same mistake as every old-world boss, he underestimated Lucky's ambition. Maranzano crowned himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, and demanded tribute from every mafia family. He enforced rigid Sicilian rules, mocked younger gangsters, and treated Luciano like a servant. What he didn't realize was that Luciano was studying him, quietly, patiently, and preparing to do to him what he had done to Masuria. Within months, Luciano struck again. He sent a team of Jewish hitmen, disguised as government agents, into Maranzano's office. They pretended to be conducting a raid before stabbing and shooting him to death. The assassination sent shockwaves through the underworld. In one move, Luciano had eliminated the last old-world don and dismantled the ancient power structure that had ruled Italian crime since its arrival in America. There would be no more kings, no more dictators, no more boss of bosses. For the first time, the Mafia would operate like a democracy, a council of equals bound by profit, not tradition. Luciano's new system became known as the Commission. It was his masterpiece, a governing body of the most powerful Mafia families in America. Each family had autonomy within its own territory, but disputes and national operations were handled collectively. It was a business model disguised as a criminal alliance, and it transformed the underworld overnight. The five families of New York, the Luciano, Bonanno, Professai, Mangano, and Gagliano families, formed the core. Other powerful bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, and Philadelphia were given seats as well. Luciano's brilliance lay in creating an illusion of equality while maintaining quiet dominance. Everyone had a voice, but he controlled the conversation. He introduced principles that would become the backbone of organized crime for generations. No unnecessary killings. No wars without approval. No interference in another family's operations. Violence would be reserved for business, not ego. He outlawed kidnappings, drug trafficking without permission, and random street murders, all of which drew attention from law enforcement. His version of the Mafia was not about honor or vengeance, it was about efficiency and profit. He understood what his predecessors never did: bloodshed was bad for business. Under Luciano's system, the Mafia began to resemble a multinational corporation. He assigned capos and underbosses, created financial divisions, and built intricate partnerships with politicians, labor unions, and business owners. Money flowed through nightclubs, construction projects, trucking unions, and gambling dens. He diversified operations like a CEO expanding into new markets. For the first time, the Mafia wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. But beyond the structure, there was something deeper at play: ideology. Luciano had transformed the Mafia from a secret brotherhood into a modern network of influence. His approach was psychological as much as strategic. He understood that men were driven by greed and pride, and he used both to control them. If a rival feared him, Luciano gave him a stake in his success. If a subordinate envied him, Luciano offered him profit to keep him loyal. He built an empire not on fear alone, but on interdependence. Everyone benefited from his system, which made betrayal a form of self-destruction. Still, he never abandoned the aura of power that made him untouchable. His name carried both respect and terror. To the public, he was a ghost, rarely seen, never caught. To the police, he was an enigma. And to his men, he was the architect of their wealth. The commission brought order to the chaos, but it also centralized control in ways few recognized. Luciano was no longer just a boss, he was a political figure within the criminal world, a silent ruler whose authority extended beyond the 5 families. The world around him noticed. Businessmen, judges, and even politicians began to interact with the Mafia as if it were a legitimate institution. Luciano's organization could fix elections, silence unions, and influence the economy. The old street thugs had become corporate executives in tailored suits. The underworld had gone professional, and its leader was the man who made it possible. Yet there was irony in his success. By removing the title of Boss of Bosses, Luciano became more powerful than any single boss could ever be. He hid his supremacy behind democracy, masking dictatorship with diplomacy. He had learned that true power didn't announce itself, it whispered, negotiated, and collected dues quietly. For the first time in American history, organized crime was organized. It had rules, systems, and hierarchy, a shadow government that mirrored legitimate America. And all of it traced back to one man's vision. Lucky Luciano had not only survived the old world of vendettas, he had buried it. He replaced chaos with control, emotion with logic, and brutality with business. From that moment on, no major decision in the criminal underworld happened without his influence. The 5 families became the pillars of power, but Luciano was their foundation. His empire stretched from the bars of Harlem to the casinos of Havana, from the docks of New York to the backrooms of Congress. He had turned the Mafia into a machine, efficient, ruthless, and unstoppable. The dream that had started in the crowded slums of the Lower East Side was now complete. Lucky Luciano had taken the scattered gangs of New York and built them into an empire of order, a criminal civilization that would outlast him, and perhaps, outlast America itself. When Lucky Luciano looked at the Mafia he had built, he didn't see a criminal empire in the traditional sense, he saw a system, a living organism powered by loyalty, fear, and profit. But he knew systems collapse when rules are unclear. The old Sicilian omerta, the code of silence, had always been the foundation of Mafia life. It demanded secrecy, obedience, and silence before the law. Yet under Luciano, this code evolved into something far more modern and psychological. It was no longer just a vow not to talk, it became a philosophy, a way of thinking, a way of surviving. The old guard followed omerta because they feared divine punishment or family shame. Luciano made his men follow it because they feared losing power. He replaced faith with logic, superstition with structure. His mafia wasn't bound by myths of honor or the ghosts of Sicily, it was driven by business. To Luciano, silence was not moral, it was strategic. Talking meant exposure. Exposure meant profit loss. Therefore, silence wasn't loyalty, it was economics. He redefined loyalty itself. Under Maranzano and Masuria, loyalty had been blind, unquestioning devotion to a single man. Luciano saw how that led to paranoia, betrayal, and downfall. In his version of the Mafia, loyalty was restructured into a chain of responsibility. Every soldier answered to a capo, every capo to an underboss, and every underboss to the boss. No one man was indispensable, not even himself. If a soldier fell, the business continued. Emotion was weakness, efficiency was survival. This shift was revolutionary. In Luciano's world, there were no kings or saints, only workers and leaders. The Mafia became less of a cult and more of a corporation. He told his men, "We're businessmen. Our product just happens to be crime." To him, the Mafia wasn't a rebellion against America, it was a reflection of it. The suits, the hierarchies, the meetings, the discipline, all mirrored the capitalist systems of Wall Street. He admired their order and adopted it. He didn't want chaos, he wanted continuity. Inside his organization, he instilled discipline like a CEO grooming executives. Meetings were formal, records were mental, and punishments were absolute. Rules were posted not on paper but in men's memories, because paper could be evidence, but memory could be erased. Breaking the code meant death, but Luciano didn't rely on fear alone. He made sure his men had a stake in success. Each capo profited when the organization profited. Each man's future was tied to the group's stability. Loyalty, in essence, became self-interest disguised as devotion. To outsiders, this new code was invisible, but inside, it was everything. Luciano's word was law, not because he demanded worship, but because everyone understood that without structure, they would all fall. It was the brilliance of collective fear. No one wanted to be the one who brought attention from the police, who disrupted the balance, who spoke out of turn. The code was no longer spiritual, it was psychological, a system of internal policing that made the Mafia self-sustaining. Even the language of the underworld changed. Words like honor, blood, and family took on new meanings. Family didn't mean relatives, it meant the organization. Respect didn't mean love, it meant understanding hierarchy. And silence didn't just mean keeping your mouth shut, it meant thinking like a machine. Luciano believed that for his empire to last, every man in it had to act not from emotion, but from logic. But make no mistake, the brutality still existed. If someone broke the code, death came swiftly and silently. There were no warnings, no trials. Luciano kept violence out of sight but never out of reach. Killings were handled like administrative decisions, not personal vendettas. A man who stole was not punished, he was removed. A rival was not murdered, he was resolved. By depersonalizing violence, Luciano made it easier for his men to commit it, and easier for himself to sleep at night. He was redefining the very psychology of crime. In the old world, mobsters ruled with raw fear. In Luciano's world, they ruled with calculated respect. His men feared him, yes, but they also admired his fairness. He rarely killed without cause, and when he did, it was justified through business logic. That balance, terror wrapped in reason, made him untouchable. Luciano also understood that control extended beyond his men. It included the perception of power. He carefully curated his public image. Unlike other gangsters, he didn't flaunt wealth or indulge in reckless violence. He dressed elegantly, spoke politely, and moved through high society with poise. He attended operas, dined with politicians, and made himself appear civilized. This wasn't vanity, it was camouflage. He knew appearances could shield the truth. To the outside world, he was a businessman. To the underworld, he was their ruler. His ability to balance both worlds made him uniquely dangerous. Law enforcement couldn't decide if he was a myth or a mastermind. Journalists called him the gangster gentleman. But behind that polished exterior was a mind constantly calculating, constantly preparing. He didn't just build an empire of crime, he built an empire of belief. Every soldier, every capo, every ally lived by a code that he had rewritten. Perhaps his greatest achievement was the illusion of stability. While the commission appeared democratic, Luciano remained the invisible center. He avoided public leadership titles, ensuring that if one family fell, the others would survive, and his influence would endure through them all. His control wasn't written in contracts or decrees, it was embedded in the psychology of the men who served him. They believed in the system because he made them believe there was no alternative. In this new world, crime wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Every move was rehearsed, every deal calculated. Luciano's code of conduct didn't just protect his empire, it elevated it. It turned thugs into businessmen, criminals into tacticians, and the Mafia into a self-perpetuating organism. This was the true genius of Lucky Luciano. He understood that real power wasn't in violence or money, it was in control. Control of minds, control of systems, control of silence. The old Mafia feared God and tradition. Luciano's Mafia feared only one thing, disruption. He had turned Omerta into something beyond loyalty, beyond fear. It was now the law of survival, the invisible thread binding thousands of men in absolute obedience. And as he looked across his empire, the nightclubs, the union halls, the warehouses humming with illicit trade, he knew he had accomplished what no one before him had. He had turned organized crime into an institution that could live beyond any man, even himself. The Code of Omerta was no longer a whisper in the dark, it was the heartbeat of the modern Mafia. By the early 1930s, the American underworld was booming like never before. Prohibition had turned alcohol into liquid gold, and the man who controlled its flow controlled everything. Lucky Luciano stood at the center of it all, not as a gangster hiding in smoky backrooms, but as a silent executive orchestrating a shadow economy. He had built the foundation, now, it was time to expand the empire. What began as a city racket was about to become a national industry. Luciano saw prohibition differently from every other mob boss. To him, it wasn't just about selling booze, it was about building a sustainable network that could survive long after the liquor laws changed. While rival gangs fought over shipments, Luciano built systems. He established distribution routes from Canada down to Florida, using warehouses, trucking companies, and even corrupt shipping lines. Everything was mapped, everything tracked. He treated the illegal liquor trade the same way legitimate tycoons treated oil or steel. He didn't just want a piece of the pie, he wanted to own the oven. He worked closely with Arnold Rothstein, the legendary Jewish gambler known as the Brain, who had once fixed the 1919 World Series. Rothstein became Luciano's mentor in the art of high-level crime, how to manage risk, how to buy politicians, and most importantly, how to stay invisible. From him, Luciano learned that the real money wasn't made in the streets but in the offices above them. When Rothstein was killed in 1928, Luciano absorbed his lessons completely and stepped into his role as the new architect of organized vice. With the help of Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Luciano built an interethnic alliance that shocked traditional mobsters. Italians, Jews, and Irish working together under one umbrella of profit, it was unheard of. But it worked. The prohibition market was too vast for one group to monopolize. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to make rivals cooperate by appealing to greed instead of loyalty. Everyone earned, everyone benefited, and everyone stayed quiet. This business-first philosophy became his signature. Speakeasies flourished under his protection. From Times Square to Chicago, nightclubs buzzed with jazz, champagne, and whispered deals. Celebrities drank in establishments secretly owned by mobsters. Politicians and cops looked the other way, their pockets lined with Luciano's money. Bootleggers, truck drivers, and bar owners all worked within his invisible system. Every bottle poured meant another dollar flowing up the chain, a network so vast that by 1931, Luciano's empire rivaled the profits of major corporations. But alcohol was only the beginning. Luciano diversified. He saw that the future of organized crime wasn't in one illegal trade, it was in managing all of them. He expanded into gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and narcotics. His men infiltrated unions like the International Longshoremen's Association and the Teamsters, giving him power over ports, trucks, and goods. Control over the docks meant control over the city's arteries. If something moved through New York, Luciano had a hand in it. Still, what made him truly untouchable wasn't just business sense, it was his understanding of perception. He made himself indispensable to both criminals and legitimate businessmen. Through front companies and silent partnerships, he laundered money into construction projects, restaurants, and entertainment venues. He made deals with producers in Hollywood, hotel owners in Havana, and casino managers in New Orleans. The lines between crime and capitalism blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. At the same time, he nurtured his image as a cultured, composed figure. He moved into luxury suites, wore custom-tailored suits, and surrounded himself with sophistication. He hosted dinners with politicians and police chiefs under the guise of businessmen's meetings. To the world, he was Charles Luciano, a successful entrepreneur with connections everywhere. To the underworld, he was the man pulling all the strings. Of course, power invites enemies. Rival gangs envied his control, while law enforcement began to suspect there was an unseen order behind the chaos. Yet Luciano was always 3 steps ahead. When trouble arose, he didn't reach for a gun, he reached for a deal. He paid off cops, lawyers, and judges. He cultivated relationships with Tammany Hall politicians, ensuring that investigations were quietly buried. If someone posed a threat, Luciano never confronted them directly, he used others, rivals, informants, or even the law, to do his work for him. His ability to balance violence with diplomacy made him untouchable. He allowed his lieutenants to handle disputes while he remained above the fray. Violence was an expense, not a statement. If blood had to be spilled, it was done efficiently, almost bureaucratically. To Luciano, murder was a form of negotiation, one that carried weight when words failed. But unlike the hot-headed gangsters of old, he never took it personally. Killing was simply another cost of doing business. Even the structure of his organization reflected corporate precision. Every operation had a manager, every territory had an overseer, and every transaction was logged mentally through trusted intermediaries. Cash flowed upward in percentages, creating a self-sustaining economy. Luciano's men operated independently but within clear boundaries, a perfect balance of autonomy and control. He didn't need to bark orders, his system spoke for him. As the money piled up, Luciano's influence reached beyond the criminal world. Union leaders answered to him. Judges accepted his bribes. Senators attended his parties. The Mafia was no longer an underground society, it had become part of the American fabric. His empire's reach extended so far that even legitimate businessmen began copying his organizational model: decentralized leadership, profit sharing, strategic cooperation. Ironically, the very structure that would one day inspire law enforcement's pursuit of him was the same structure that made him unstoppable. Yet despite the empire's success, Luciano remained cautious. He knew that fortune breeds betrayal. He never fully trusted anyone, not even his closest allies. He kept information compartmentalized, making sure no one man knew too much. Every ally was also a potential enemy, every friend, a future liability. It was paranoia, but a useful one. In a world built on crime and deception, survival depended on never believing entirely in loyalty. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's organization was the beating heart of organized crime in America. His bootlegging networks, gambling dens, and labor connections made him a millionaire many times over. But beyond wealth, he had achieved something greater: stability. He had done what no mobster before him had accomplished: turned chaos into commerce, violence into order, crime into enterprise. He was no longer just a gangster. He was a businessman, a strategist, a silent emperor who governed an empire of vice through reason instead of rage. The world saw him as lucky, but in truth, luck had nothing to do with it. It was vision, discipline, and intellect that built his kingdom. And as he stood atop his empire, surveying the bustling streets of Manhattan from his penthouse window, he knew the truth that every man in power eventually learns: the higher you rise, the thinner the air becomes. For all his cunning, all his success, one question began to whisper at the back of his mind: how long could perfection last before envy, betrayal, and fate demanded their due? By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire had reached its zenith. Every speakeasy, every dock, every gambling den whispered his name in secret. To the outside world, America was still recovering from the Great Depression, desperate for hope and stability. But beneath the surface, another economy thrived, one built on fear, greed, and shadow deals. Luciano had built a machine so vast that even he struggled to see its full reach. Yet the higher he climbed, the more enemies gathered in the shadows. Power, after all, doesn't just attract followers, it breeds rivals who dream of cutting the king down. The streets had grown quieter, but that calm was deceptive. It was the silence that comes before a storm. The old ways had not died completely. In the corners of the underworld, men still whispered about honor and revenge. Many resented Luciano's modern ways, his alliances with Jews and Irish, his businesslike approach to crime. To them, he was a traitor to tradition, a heretic who had turned sacred blood oaths into corporate agreements. The Sicilian purists in particular despised him, and some dreamed of restoring the old code. It was only a matter of time before that resentment found its outlet. Within the Mafia itself, division simmered. Luciano's commission had brought order, but order is fragile when built on ambition. Some capos grew too rich, too independent, too bold. They began questioning the need for central control. Others suspected Luciano of taking a larger cut than he admitted. In a world where loyalty was measured in dollars, suspicion was inevitable. Luciano handled it the only way he knew: through quiet manipulation. He played rivals against each other, feeding rumors, rewarding obedience, and letting paranoia consume those who doubted him. To Luciano, internal conflict wasn't a threat, it was a tool. But beyond the criminal world, a more dangerous enemy was stirring: the law itself. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, a sharp, ambitious reformer, had begun piecing together the puzzle of organized crime. He understood what few others did, that these weren't random gangsters, but an organized hierarchy with one man at the top. Dewey's crusade to expose the Mafia wasn't just about justice, it was political theater. Catching Luciano would make him a national hero. And so, the government began moving against the shadow empire with a determination that even Luciano's money couldn't easily buy off. Dewey's investigation started small: raids on brothels, gambling houses, and union offices. But each arrest, each bribe, each piece of testimony began to trace a line back to one man. Luciano's name appeared again and again, whispered by frightened underlings trying to save themselves. For years, Luciano had maintained distance from the street-level crimes. He never signed anything, never left a paper trail, and his orders were passed through layers of lieutenants. But now, the walls were closing in. Law enforcement had evolved, they were learning to think like businessmen too. Inside his empire, the pressure began to show. Every ally, every associate, now carried the scent of potential betrayal. Luciano's inner circle, once bound by profit and fear, began to fracture under interrogation. Cops dangled immunity deals, whispered promises of freedom. It was a new kind of warfare, psychological, invisible, relentless. Luciano's men didn't fear bullets anymore, they feared subpoenas. Meanwhile, outside New York, other crime families were rising. Chicago had Al Capone's successors. Buffalo, Cleveland, and Detroit all had their own bosses who admired but didn't always obey Luciano. The national network he created, the Commission, was becoming too large, too decentralized. It worked beautifully when everyone was loyal, but now, distant families began making their own moves. The unity Luciano had enforced through intellect was starting to unravel under the weight of greed and ego. Still, Luciano remained calm. He'd survived worse. He believed no one could touch him because he had corrupted nearly everyone worth corrupting. Judges, police captains, city officials, all on his payroll. He had seen investigations come and go, and each time he came out untouched. But Dewey was different. He was young, incorruptible, and hungry for fame. He wanted Luciano's head on a plate, and he would stop at nothing to get it. As Dewey's task force closed in, Luciano shifted tactics. He tightened his network, burned records, moved operations, and silenced potential informants. He even fled briefly to Florida, hoping to ride out the storm. But the walls kept closing. His brothel operations, long dismissed as small-scale rackets, became the key to his downfall. Dewey's men built a case linking Luciano directly to prostitution rings across New York, using testimony from dozens of women and pimps who claimed to work under his orders. It didn't matter that the truth was murky, perception was enough. Dewey was building a story, not just a case. As the investigation intensified, betrayal became inevitable. Cops raided safe houses. Lawyers warned of indictments. Some of Luciano's trusted men were arrested and quickly broke under pressure. He had spent his life manipulating loyalty like a weapon, but now the weapon turned on him. The same logic that kept his empire running, fear and profit, now worked against him. When facing prison, fear outweighed loyalty, and profit vanished. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the streets that some families within the commission were cooperating with the authorities behind his back. Luciano knew the old rule: there is no such thing as eternal loyalty in crime, only temporary alliance. But hearing it in action stung. His empire was crumbling, not because of rival bullets, but because of words. By 1935, Dewey's investigation had reached its peak. Dozens of arrests had been made. Newspapers ran stories about the Vice King of New York. Luciano's face was on the front page, painted as the mastermind behind every illicit pleasure in the city. For the first time, he was losing control of the narrative. The man who once operated invisibly was now a household name. In the underworld, fear spread like disease. Some gangsters went underground, others fled. The same people who once toasted Luciano's genius now whispered about his downfall. He had outsmarted mobsters, politicians, and rivals, but this was a new kind of enemy. The law wasn't a man you could bribe, it was an idea. And ideas couldn't be killed. As Luciano sat in his suite at the Waldorf Astoria, surrounded by luxury and silence, he must have felt the irony closing in. He had built his empire on intelligence, on systems that couldn't fail. But in his brilliance, he had overlooked one thing: the human factor. Fear, greed, ambition, betrayal, they weren't just tools of power, they were its inevitable undoing. And though the city still bowed to his invisible influence, the storm he had long kept at bay was finally at his door. The hidden war, between the underworld and the law, between loyalty and fear, was about to erupt. And for the first time in his life, lucky Luciano would find himself not as the hunter, but as the prey. By 1936, the storm that had been brewing finally struck. Thomas E. Dewey, relentless and incorruptible, unleashed a legal assault that would shake the foundations of Lucky Luciano's empire. The man who had built the most disciplined, modern criminal organization in American history suddenly found himself hunted, not by rivals with guns, but by prosecutors with evidence. It was a different kind of war, not fought on the streets, but in courtrooms and headlines. And this time, Luciano couldn't hide behind layers of subordinates or bribed officials. The law had learned his language, and now it was speaking it back to him. For years, Luciano had been careful to keep his hands clean. He never signed papers, never issued direct orders, and never appeared in the same room as a crime. But Dewey's investigators had done something unprecedented. They built a web of witnesses who could connect the dots. Through months of raids and interrogations, they uncovered a network of brothels across New York that funneled money up the chain to Luciano's associates. The press labeled it the Vice Empire, and it made front-page news. Prostitutes, pimps, and madams testified that Charlie Lucky was the man behind it all, the unseen owner of pleasure and sin. Luciano denied everything. He laughed off the accusations, calling them fantasies spun by desperate people. He still believed he was untouchable, that no jury would convict him, that money and influence would save him as they always had. But times had changed. The public, still scarred by Depression-era corruption, was hungry for justice. Dewey became a national hero, and every move he made against Luciano was followed by flashing cameras and roaring headlines. The myth of Lucky Luciano, the untouchable, elegant gangster, was being rewritten into that of a moral villain. When the arrest finally came, it wasn't in a dramatic gunfight or a midnight raid. It happened in 1936, quietly, in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Luciano was staying at a luxury hotel when local police, tipped off by New York authorities, surrounded the building. There were no bullets, no chase, only the click of handcuffs. For the first time in his life, Luciano was powerless. As they escorted him through the lobby, reporters swarmed, shouting his name. He smiled faintly for the cameras, masking the fury beneath his calm expression. To the world, it looked like arrogance. To Luciano, it was survival. Even in defeat, he refused to look weak. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational in American history. Dewey painted Luciano as the master of vice, the man who corrupted an entire city. Dozens of witnesses took the stand, describing how his organization controlled hundreds of brothels, demanded cuts from every transaction, and enforced obedience through terror. The prosecution's narrative was simple and irresistible. Luciano wasn't just a gangster, he was the architect of moral decay. Luciano's defense team, funded by his vast fortune, argued that the evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, the accusations absurd. How could a man as powerful as Lucky Luciano bother with brothels when he already controlled multi-million-dollar rackets? But it didn't matter. The public wanted a villain, and Dewey had provided one. The jury deliberated for only 9 hours before finding Luciano guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, effectively a death sentence for a man in his late 30s. When the verdict was read, Luciano didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a business deal gone wrong. But inside, rage boiled. He knew the trial had been built on manipulation and political theater. He had bribed judges before, bought detectives, silenced rivals, yet this time, none of it worked. For the first time, he had been outmaneuvered. As the guards led him away, the press hailed Dewey as the man who brought down America's most powerful gangster. Politicians congratulated themselves on restoring morality to the city. The people cheered. But in the dim cells of Sing Sing prison, behind steel bars and the echo of footsteps, Lucky Luciano began to plan again. Even in defeat, his mind never stopped calculating. He used his charm to win over guards, his money to gain small luxuries, and his influence to control men even from the inside. Prison couldn't erase the loyalty he had built, it only changed its form. Messages flowed in and out through lawyers and visitors. The commission continued to operate, and his empire adapted without him. The organization he had designed was too efficient, too decentralized to collapse. Luciano had built it precisely for this reason, to outlive any one man, even himself. But behind the cold precision, something else stirred. Isolation forced him to confront what he had built. For all his brilliance, for all his victories, he now sat alone in a cell while younger men ran his empire. He began to realize that control, the very thing he had chased his whole life, was slipping away. Every order he gave from behind bars took longer to execute, every ally on the outside became more independent. Power, he learned, doesn't disappear with defeat, it decays slowly, eaten by time and distance. In the silence of his cell, he might have thought back to the choices that brought him there, the betrayals, the cold calculations, the endless balancing act of loyalty and fear. Maybe, for the first time, he wondered whether he had outsmarted himself. The man who had built a perfect system had also made himself unnecessary to it. Yet even as he grappled with these thoughts, Luciano refused to be forgotten. He still had cards to play, alliances to resurrect, secrets to trade, favors to call in. The man who had once ruled America's criminal world from luxury suites would soon learn to rule it from behind bars. The fall had come, but the game was far from over. For lucky Luciano, the arrest wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of another chapter, one where intellect, influence, and survival would once again decide who truly held power. The empire had lost its leader, but the mind behind it was still very much alive, waiting for the next move. The trial of Lucky Luciano became one of the most dramatic spectacles in American legal history, part courtroom theater, part moral crusade. Newspapers called it, "The People versus the Devil," and every day, crowds gathered outside the courthouse hoping to glimpse the infamous gangster who had ruled New York from the shadows. For years, Luciano had been a name whispered in fear and respect. Now, he was on display, stripped of his mystique, framed under harsh lights, forced to play the role of defendant in a story written by his enemies. Thomas E. Dewey understood exactly what he was doing. This was not just about justice, it was about symbolism. He wanted to prove that intellect and law could triumph over money and corruption, that no man, not even Lucky Luciano, was above the system. To Dewey, the courtroom was his battlefield, and public opinion was his weapon. He built his case meticulously, blending evidence with narrative, fact with performance. He didn't just want to convict Luciano, he wanted to destroy the myth of his invincibility. The prosecution presented a parade of witnesses, madams, prostitutes, pimps, and middlemen, all eager to testify that Luciano was the true power behind New York's brothel industry. Some cried on the stand, some trembled, others recited rehearsed statements. Their stories painted a lurid picture of an empire of vice, women trafficked across state lines, brutal enforcers collecting protection fees, and every dollar funneled upward into Luciano's accounts. Dewey's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade as he linked every operation, every crime, back to one name, Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano sat silently through it all, dressed immaculately in tailored suits, his expression unreadable. To the jury, he appeared calm and detached, too calm, some thought, for a man whose freedom was at stake. But that composure was his greatest defense. He understood the power of appearances. To show anger or fear would be to concede defeat. Instead, he projected control, as if the trial were merely an inconvenience, not a reckoning. His defense attorneys worked tirelessly to dismantle Dewey's case. They argued that the witnesses were liars seeking leniency, that the entire prosecution rested on hearsay and fabrication. They reminded the jury that no money, no records, no direct orders linked Luciano to the alleged crimes. The man on trial, one lawyer thundered, is not the head of vice, he's the victim of ambition. But Dewey's strategy was psychological, not just legal. He had already won in the court of public opinion. The newspapers fed on every word. Headlines screamed, Luciano, the vice king exposed. Radio hosts replayed courtroom drama for millions of listeners. To a weary nation recovering from the Depression, the trial became a morality tale, the triumph of law over corruption, the cleansing of a sinful city. Dewey became a household name, and Luciano became a symbol of everything America wanted to believe it was purging. Behind the spectacle, however, the case was fragile. Much of the testimony was contradictory. Some witnesses had been coerced, others coached. Yet Dewey understood the power of narrative over fact. He didn't need to prove every detail, he only needed to convince the jury that Luciano represented organized vice. And in that, he succeeded brilliantly. In June 1936, after weeks of arguments, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison, was the harshest ever given for such charges. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to telephones, typing headlines before the echo of the gavel faded. Dewey smiled for the cameras, his reputation secured. America had found its villain and its hero. Luciano, as always, remained composed. As the judge read his sentence, he stared straight ahead, unblinking. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply replied, "I've been framed. But it's all right, everybody gets their turn." Those words, calm and chilling, would be quoted in papers for years to come. He walked out between guards like a man attending a business meeting, head high, coat draped perfectly over his arm. But behind the calm exterior, fury simmered. He had built an empire based on precision, manipulation, and control, and now he was a prisoner of chaos. The very system he had manipulated so effortlessly had learned his tactics and turned them against him. He wasn't beaten by violence, but by intelligence, by a prosecutor who, in many ways, mirrored his own strategic mind. Dewey had used the press the way Luciano had used fear, to control the narrative. The transfer to prison marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. Reporters followed the convoy that carried him to Sing Sing, photographing every step as if chronicling the burial of a king. Inside the cold stone walls, guards eyed him with a mix of curiosity and respect. They knew who he was, the man who once ruled New York from penthouses and speakeasies now lived in a concrete cell. But Luciano wasn't broken. He adapted quickly, turning even confinement into a new form of control. He used charm and generosity to win favor with inmates and guards alike. Cigarettes, favors, quiet deals, all became currency. Within months, he had influence even behind bars. The warden trusted him enough to mediate disputes among prisoners. Luciano understood better than anyone that power was not about freedom, it was about influence. And influence could thrive anywhere. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, the world moved on. Dewey rode his victory to political fame, becoming a national figure. The Mafia reorganized, families shifting loyalties, new bosses rising to fill the void. Yet even as others tried to claim his throne, Luciano's name lingered like a shadow. His organization, the structure he had built, continued to function. His methods were too effective, his rules too ingrained to disappear. Still, the myth of his untouchability was shattered. The man who once seemed immortal was now just another inmate, eating the same meals, following the same schedules. For the public, it was justice. For the underworld, it was a warning. If lucky Luciano could fall, anyone could. And yet, within those prison walls, a strange thing began to happen. Luciano's legend didn't fade, it grew. Stories spread among inmates and guards about his composure, his intelligence, his quiet dignity. To some, he became a symbol of control under pressure, a man who refused to break no matter what cage he was placed in. His enemies thought they had ended him. But in truth, the myth of Lucky Luciano had only evolved. The trial and the sentence marked the end of the visible empire, but it also transformed him from a man into a legend, a ghost who haunted both criminals and lawmen. He had lost his freedom, but he had achieved something far more enduring, immortality through infamy. And deep inside, Luciano knew that the story was far from over. He had built an empire once. Given time, he would find a way to influence it again, even from the other side of the bars. Inside the towering walls of Clinton Correctional Facility, known to the world simply as Dannemora, Lucky Luciano began the next phase of his life. He had lost his freedom, his empire, and the luxury that once defined him, but what he had not lost was his mind. In the cold monotony of prison life, where most men broke under the weight of routine, Luciano adapted. He treated imprisonment like another business problem, a change in environment, not an end. The same intelligence that had built an empire now turned inward, crafting new forms of influence within the bleak confines of his cell. From the very first week, Luciano understood that survival depended on control. Not physical control, he no longer commanded soldiers with guns, but psychological control. He observed the guards, the warden, the inmates. He learned who wanted favors, who could be bought, who feared him, and who might be useful. Within months, he had quietly restructured his surroundings. Cigarettes, food, and small luxuries became his new currency. He rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal, and soon, even inside prison, the name Lucky carried weight. He made himself indispensable. When disputes broke out among prisoners, guards turned to Luciano to calm tensions. He mediated conflicts, organized work assignments, and ensured order where chaos once ruled. The same organizational genius that built the commission now governed a prison wing. Luciano had transformed from inmate to unofficial administrator, commanding respect through calm authority rather than force. His influence extended so quietly that the warden himself began consulting him on prison matters. But beneath this composed surface, Luciano burned with anger. Every day behind bars reminded him of the empire he had lost, the penthouses, the power, the respect. He read voraciously, studying law, business, and psychology. He followed every newspaper report about the Mafia, noting which bosses rose and which fell. His empire had survived his downfall, but it was evolving without him. New names dominated headlines: Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, men who had once answered to him but now carved their own paths. Luciano watched from afar, his pride wounded yet fascinated. The structure he had built still stood, proof of his brilliance, but it no longer needed him. Even so, his reach didn't die completely. Through lawyers, visitors, and coded letters, Luciano continued to communicate with the outside world. He sent messages disguised as legal correspondence or friendly greetings, instructions woven into harmless phrases. Some orders were relayed through guards he had bribed. From within the stone walls of Dannemora, he maintained quiet influence over men who still revered him. To them, he was more than a former boss, he was the architect of everything they knew. Then came the war. In 1941, when the United States entered World War II, the country's priorities shifted. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, threatening American ships. Espionage and sabotage became real fears. The U.S. Navy realized it needed help protecting New York's ports, the same docks and unions long controlled by organized crime. Through intermediaries, intelligence officers reached out to the one man who could guarantee cooperation from the underworld, Lucky Luciano. It was a moment of supreme irony. The government that had sentenced him to decades in prison now needed his help. In exchange for assistance, Luciano saw a path back to relevance. Operation Underworld was born, a secret collaboration between U.S. naval intelligence and the Mafia. From behind bars, Luciano used his connections to secure the cooperation of dockworkers, union bosses, and longshoremen. Sabotage disappeared, and the flow of military supplies resumed smoothly. His empire, once seen as America's disease, had become its unlikely cure. The operation extended even further. In 1943, when the Allies prepared to invade Sicily, U.S. intelligence once again turned to Luciano. His old contacts in Italy, men who had once served him or his allies, provided maps, names, and local intelligence. Some historians later argued that the Mafia's influence helped ensure the invasion's success by turning Sicilian resistance against the fascists. Whether exaggerated or not, it cemented Luciano's reputation as a man whose power transcended walls, borders, and even nations. When news of his cooperation reached political circles, debate erupted. Some saw him as a patriot in disguise, others called it a scandal. But for Luciano, it was strategy. He knew the government owed him now, and debts, even from nations, could be collected. His attorney began pushing for early release, arguing that his contribution to the war effort warranted leniency. For years, the request was denied, but the tide was turning. Meanwhile, life in prison became paradoxically comfortable. Luciano had privileges no ordinary inmate could dream of. He had private meetings, access to outside communication, and even decent food and wine smuggled in. Guards who once despised him now served as intermediaries. Even the warden, whether out of respect or fear, ensured Luciano's needs were quietly met. He had turned punishment into management. Yet beneath the control, there was isolation. Nights were long and quiet. Luciano often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the ghosts of his past, the betrayals, the executions, the faces of those who had died for his ambition. Power had always insulated him from reflection, but prison stripped away distraction. For the first time, he was forced to face the weight of his legacy. He had built an empire that mirrored America's own capitalism, efficient, ruthless, unstoppable. But now that machine ran without him. By 1945, as the war ended, public opinion began to shift. The Mafia still thrived, but the government's partnership with Luciano had become an uncomfortable secret. Dewey, the very man who had destroyed him, was now governor of New York. And in a twist worthy of fiction, it was Dewey who eventually signed the order that commuted Luciano's sentence, citing his wartime cooperation. In 1946, after serving 9 years of a 50-year term, Luciano walked free, but freedom came with exile. He was deported to Italy, forbidden from ever returning to the United States. When he stepped off the plane in Naples, the crowd that greeted him was a strange mix of admirers, journalists, and silent gangsters. He was older now, heavier, but the charisma remained. Prison hadn't broken him, it had refined him. He carried himself with the same calm authority that had once made judges tremble. Even in exile, he looked like a man in command. But as the ship pulled away from the shores of America, Luciano must have known what he was leaving behind, not just the country, but the throne he had built. The Mafia he had organized had evolved into something larger, something beyond his control. He was free, but his kingdom was gone. Still, for a man like Lucky Luciano, exile didn't mean retirement. It meant opportunity, a new frontier to conquer. The world might have changed, but the rules of power, influence, and survival had not. And so, even from across an ocean, the man who had once ruled America's underworld began planning his return, not in person, but in influence, through whispers, alliances, and the indestructible legacy of his name. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the plane in Naples in 1946, the flashbulbs from reporters exploded like gunfire. The Italian air was humid, thick with the scent of the sea and the weight of exile. He had traded the cold steel of an American prison for the open air of his ancestral homeland, but freedom, for him, felt like another kind of confinement. The government had given him his liberty only to take away his empire. America, the land that had made him rich, powerful, and infamous, was now forbidden ground. He was a king without a kingdom, a man who could never again set foot in the world he had ruled. In Italy, Luciano was both a curiosity and a threat. To the public, he was a legend, the great American gangster returning home, his name whispered in cafes and newspapers alike. To the authorities, he was a contagion. The Italian government, newly rebuilding after the fall of fascism, feared that Luciano's presence would reawaken the old mafia networks in Sicily. Police followed him constantly, his phones were tapped, his letters intercepted. Every time he moved cities, the headlines followed: Luciano in Rome, Luciano in Naples, Luciano suspected of rebuilding the mafia. But Luciano had no interest in playing the old game, not at first. He was older now, heavier, and his health had begun to falter from years of stress and imprisonment. Still, his mind was as sharp as ever. He rented a modest apartment in Naples, dressed impeccably as always, and began reaching out quietly to old contacts, smugglers, businessmen, and crime figures who remembered his name like a prayer. It wasn't nostalgia that drove him, it was instinct. Power, once tasted, never fully leaves a man's blood. It didn't take long before opportunity found him. Post-war Europe was in chaos. Cities were rebuilding, economies were fragile, and governments were riddled with corruption. The black market thrived. American cigarettes, liquor, and luxury goods were worth more than gold. Luciano saw the same thing he'd seen during Prohibition, a void waiting to be filled. From Naples, he began quietly coordinating smuggling operations through the port, using contacts in the Sicilian and Neapolitan underworlds. Through intermediaries, he reconnected with Meyer Lansky, who was now expanding gambling operations in Havana, Cuba. The two men had always understood each other, Lansky with his mathematical precision, Luciano with his commanding charisma. Together, even from opposite sides of the Atlantic, they envisioned a global enterprise, one that fused the American Mafia, the Sicilian underworld, and the lucrative casino trade of the Caribbean. In 1947, Luciano made his first move to re-establish influence. Using forged documents, he traveled secretly to Havana to meet Lansky and other top mobsters. It was a reunion of legends, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and others who had inherited the structure he'd created. They met in luxury hotels and nightclubs, drinking and talking like old kings. The Havana Conference, as history would later call it, was more than a meeting, it was a declaration. Luciano was reminding everyone that he still existed, that the mind that built the commission had not retired. The Havana plan was ambitious. The Mafia would expand its operations into international narcotics and gambling, using Havana as the new capital of vice. Luciano negotiated with drug traffickers from Europe and established shipping routes for heroin that would eventually flood American streets in the 1950s. For all his talk of reform and efficiency, he knew that narcotics were the new gold rush, dangerous, yes, but irresistible. He justified it to himself as business, detached from morality. If it's not me, he once told an associate, someone else will do it worse. But his time in Havana was short-lived. American authorities, furious at reports of his re-emergence, pressured the Cuban government to deport him back to Italy. The dream of running an empire from the tropics collapsed overnight. When he arrived back in Naples, humiliated but unbroken, he simply adjusted. "They can send me anywhere," he reportedly said, "but they can't send me away from myself." Back in Italy, his life became a strange duality, half exile, half myth. Officially, he lived quietly, avoiding open involvement in crime. Unofficially, he was still the godfather of global networks that moved drugs, money, and influence. He maintained contact with his old associates through coded letters and visitors who came under false pretenses. Every decision he made, every favor granted or denied, rippled across continents. Yet even as he maintained control, something inside him began to shift. He had spent decades manipulating people, orchestrating power, bending the world to his will. But now, in his 50s, the nights grew longer, quieter, lonelier. He had no wife, no children, no peace. The people he trusted most were either dead, imprisoned, or waiting for his fortune to fade. He lived surrounded by luxury, silk shirts, expensive wine, imported cigars, yet everything felt hollow. The empire he built had outgrown him. The new generation of mobsters respected him, but they didn't need him. They used his name like a brand, but the world of crime had evolved into something colder and more mechanical than even Luciano could have imagined. Occasionally, he was seen walking along the harbor in Naples, staring out at the sea, the same sea that had carried him to America as a boy. The waves must have reminded him of that journey from Sicily to New York, the one that transformed Salvatore Lucania into Lucky Luciano. He had conquered two worlds, only to lose them both. In quiet moments, he confessed to friends that he missed the old New York, the chaos, the danger, the feeling of purpose. "Over there," he once said, "I knew who I was. Here, I'm just a story. As the 1950s drew to a close, age and exhaustion began to catch him. His health declined from heart disease, but his reputation never did. He remained under constant surveillance, Italian police, American intelligence, and journalists all waiting for him to make one final move. He became a ghost of his own legend, a man trapped in the myth he had created. Still, he played his role with grace, the tailored suits, the slick hair, the faint smirk that once disarmed killers. In his final years, Luciano began speaking about his life with an unusual candor. He admitted no guilt, but there was a strange acceptance in his words. "I made my own luck," he told one reporter. "And luck runs out." He knew he had changed history, not just of crime, but of capitalism itself. He had proven that organization, logic, and fear could be combined to build an empire, legal or not. In that sense, his influence reached far beyond the Mafia. It reflected the darker truth of the modern world, that power always finds its own structure. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano collapsed from a heart attack at Naples International Airport. Ironically, he had just finished a meeting with a film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. As he fell to the ground, onlookers rushed to help, not realizing they were witnessing the death of one of the most powerful men in the history of organized crime. The man who had survived knives, bullets, betrayal, and prison had finally been undone by his own heart. They say he died smiling, perhaps because, in that final moment, he understood the full arc of his story. He had been born poor, risen to power, created order from chaos, and lived long enough to see himself become both legend and ghost. The world would go on speaking his name, analyzing his methods, imitating his systems. And somewhere, deep in the silence of his final breath, Lucky Luciano might have thought what only men like him can think, that even death is just another transaction, the last deal to close. Lucky Luciano's legacy cannot be measured only by the empire he built, but by the system he left behind. Before him, organized crime was chaos, gangs warring for scraps, ruled by emotion and superstition. After him, it became an institution. The five families, the commission, the rules of loyalty and silence, all bore his signature. He had turned crime into a business, profit into a science, and fear into policy. Even after his death, his structure endured. Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Carlo Gambino all ruled under his blueprint. Every major mafia decision for decades followed the principles he designed: avoid public attention, use logic over ego, and make violence the last resort. He had given the mafia a corporate soul. Yet his legacy went beyond the underworld. Law enforcement studied his methods, adopting his same organizational logic: task forces, hierarchies, coordination. The government that once sought to destroy him ended up mirroring him. His vision of order became the model for both sides of the law. But Luciano's story was never about crime alone. It was about human nature, ambition, control, the hunger to shape chaos. He embodied the immigrant dream twisted by survival, proving that intellect could lift a man as high as it could damn him. His empire outlived him, but so did his warning, that power, without conscience, becomes its own prison. In the end, Luciano was neither saint nor monster. He was the mirror of his era, a man who built structure in a world that worshipped greed. His legend remains not because he was unstoppable, but because he showed the world that even evil, when organized, can look like genius. Lucky Luciano's story closes not with his crimes, but with the lesson behind them. He proved that intellect could be as dangerous as violence, and that discipline could turn chaos into empire. From the crowded slums of New York to the luxury suites of power, he built order where none existed, but at the cost of his soul. He had outsmarted enemies, lawmen, and fate itself for decades, yet in the end, it was reflection that defeated him. Exiled in Italy, far from the city that had made him king, Luciano learned the cruel truth of power: once it's achieved, it begins to decay. His empire lived on, but it no longer belonged to him. Still, his name endured. The systems he built, hierarchy, silence, loyalty, shaped the Mafia for generations and inspired the logic of modern power. To this day, his ghost lingers wherever ambition replaces morality, and control becomes a creed. Lucky Luciano did not believe in luck. He believed in calculation. And though death silenced him, his lesson remains clear, that power built without conscience always demands its price.